Hello to the participants that we do have part of our series today. This session is going to be recorded and put onto our website, so don't fret to the ones that haven't been able to make it. Basically, today what we're doing is the first session in our 4-part series. It's for international students, and we're just going to be talking about the residential tenancies space, specifically discussing the Residential Tenancies Act 1997 for Victoria. And then we're going to be discussing some of the newer amendments that came into place on the 29th of March. So this series is called Know Your Rights. And yes, it is catered more towards international students. So I do apologize if we're going back to basics a little bit. But we'll start from ground up. So just a little bit about ourselves. We're from Tenants Victoria. We're also currently being supported by Study Victoria as well in the International Student Wellbeing Program. And so we are a specialist community legal centre, and we deal specifically with tenancy matters. And we were founded over 45 years ago for the people, by the people. So that's where we kind of want to keep our vision. We want to make sure that everyone is able to get into safe, secure and affordable housing in Victoria, and to make sure that it's a fair housing system as well. And so one of our main aims is to work with renters directly, as well as working in the background on social change and policy work as well. But some of our more practical work looks like legal advice and support, or we provide some advocacy work as well. If you need to go to BCAT or talk to, you're no longer landlords anymore, your rental provider, and we do education similarly to what we're doing today. And then we've got Georgia with us as well, one of the lawyers from our legal services team. I'm Julie, and I'm the international student outreach worker at Tenants Victoria, and I'm also one of the lawyers currently on secondment into the International Student Wellbeing Program. So my details are here, and they'll also be provided at the end of the our little series here today as well. And then I just wanted to preface our advice line in case anyone wants to note that down, or the question comes up partway through the series, where do I go for help? So you can either get in contact with myself through those details on the page, or call our advice line if there's more urgent questions that you might have had to do with your tenancy. And then we're going into episode 1, which we're going to cover what a tenancy is and whether you're protected by the Residential Tenancies Act. And then this is today's agenda. And then I just do want to note that we don't cover, even though the RTA does cover this, we don't cover caravan parks, dwelling, a Part A4 dwelling, specialist disability accommodation or boarding arrangements in this series. We are catering it more towards the accommodation types that international students would usually find themselves in. So moving forward, I'm going to pass over to Georgia. Then take over, and I'm going to put myself on mute.
Thank you. I'll just see if I can make my screen bigger. Now, I'm going to talk through this, and Julie, you're going to move the slides for me. Awesome. So the first thing that I wanted to talk about is the terminology. We have had a bit of an update. So it's okay if we're still using tenants and landlords, but there has been a new change. And so now we refer to tenants as renters, and landlords are now going to be called residential rental providers. Just to shorten it for me, I'm probably just going to call it rental provider. If I do slip into the landlord tenant thing, we're all learning this together. So you know what I mean, but I hopefully won't. And also another change is we often speak about leases. This is now going to be called a rental agreement. If you say lease agreement, we're going to know what you mean, but the new terminology is there and we'll all get used to it pretty soon. One thing has stayed the same, which is the agent. Your real estate agent will absolutely still be called an agent, and so those are the new terminologies. We'll move over to what the common types of rental agreements are. Now, Most people are aware of these. One is a fixed term and the other is a periodic. Now, I'm going to read from the slide because Julie's written it so perfectly. Effectively, if you have a fixed term agreement, say it's 12 months, and the end of your lease is going to be today, the 20th of April, 2021. People often will ask, what happens after the 21st? What happens, is my lease end? Absolutely not. It rolls over into what we call a periodic. Some people call it a month-to-month lease. It is certainly the same thing. So you will still be in a tenancy agreement. It's just now called a periodic. When you're in a periodic, you can also sign a new fixed term agreement if you'd like to, if that's the agreement that you and your residential rental provider want to do. So they are the two most common types of rental agreements. We do have a couple other rental agreements. Now we have the most common is what we call a short fixed term. These are generally 6 to 12 months, and it can be longer than that. We do know of instances where you've signed up for 2 years. Anything under 5 years will be what we call just a short fixed term agreement. With these types of agreements, they can be written. We recommend they're put in writing, but they can also be verbal, and sometimes they can be a little bit of both. However, we do recommend that if you are a student and you're wanting to sign onto one of these agreements, download the form from the Consumer Affairs Victoria. We're going to show it to you later, and put the details in there, because the important thing is to know, how long is your lease going to last for? And how much is your rent going to be? These are all really important questions that can be answered and confirmed in a residential tenancy agreement, which I've already said tenancy agreements. We'll all get there. The next rental agreement, which is not so common, but they do exist, is a rental agreement, what's called a long-term rental agreement, and that's when it's 5 years or more. This does have some benefits in that it offers more security and stability for people who would like a longer term lease. If you're looking at a longer term lease, do seek advice. Reach out to your advocate, reach out to Tenants Victoria. There are some information, some things that you should know about long-term leases and your rights. That's really important to know. So they are there for security, but certainly get some advice before you go and sign them. And the next one we've touched on slightly, but you can start with a lease agreement without it being a fixed term. And then it's simply a periodic, that month-to-month rolling lease. If you do have one of these and they don't have a specific end date, it will just continue to go until somebody gives you somebody leaves. So somebody might be able to give a notice of intention to vacate, or your rental provider may ask you to leave. Now, I think those are the last three. Let's go into our next slide, Julie. The important thing to take away today is that it doesn't matter what lease you have, whether it's a periodic or a fixed term, whether it's a 5-year term, you are going to be covered under the Residential Tenancies Act. And that means there's going to be protections for you. Whether or not it's written or verbal, those protections will be there. We're also going to talk about subletting arrangements and share house arrangements and rooming house arrangements. All of these are protected under the Act, and those rules are there to protect you. I really like this slide because it's really important to know that you may have arranged this tenancy agreement over WeChat or over WhatsApp or over Facebook, and some of the terms were discussed on the phone. The bond was discussed on the phone, maybe when the rent was due was discussed on the phone. And it's really important that students know that if the agreement is verbal, it is still enforceable and it's still valid. My recommendation would be, even if it's verbal, once you find out that you don't have a tenancy agreement and you'd like that stability, download the form from Consumer Affairs Victoria and put it all in writing. But If that doesn't happen, that's still okay. You're still protected under the Act. If you have any questions about this, reach out to Julie or Tenants Victoria so we can help you. Now, this next slide is something we've raised because we get a lot of queries from international students and from renters asking, do we have an agreement? And I thought we would just raise a couple of the things that how you would find out if you have a tenancy agreement. The first one is pretty obvious. If you've signed a rental agreement, then you're covered under the Act and you're in a rental agreement. Now, it's important to find out some things for the rest of your tenancy that you need to know. There's a couple of them. You need to know how much you need to pay and when you need to pay it. Those terms are super important because if there's any dispute about that, renters may find themselves in strife. The other important topic is, when are you allowed to move in? You need to confirm that date. And of course, when you have to move out. And that's important in the sense of, do you want it to be a fixed term where the end of your lease is a particular date? Or do you want it to leave it flexible and continue as a periodic so you have that flexibility? If you're unsure, reach out to Julie, our email address, and you can make an appointment on the link that she had at the beginning of our slides, and she'll be able to provide you with your assistance to figure out what your circumstances are.
Awesome. So now I'm going to take over and talk about what a rooming house is and how we identify it. A lot of the times, the most problematic issue we have is identifying a rooming house, because it can look like any other house. And the reason why we're going through rooming houses versus shared houses like co-tenancies is because they can look the same. And, even though a lot of the main points are discussed, it could still technically be a rooming house. And until the 29th of March, 2021, being in a rooming house, you could either use a residency agreement or a residential tenancy agreement. So it added to that confusion. So there's going to be a couple of changes now with the new amendments in place, which we'll go through in a sec. But just in terms of what is a rooming house, it's a very, very basic definition. It should be able to house up to 4 people, regardless of how many rooms there are. And it's normally an individually signed agreement per person. So we usually look at things like, do you have a lock on the door? Do you have the key to that lock? Is your room just your own, or do you share it with someone? So with rooming houses, you can have multiple people in a room. There might be like 2 beds on a separate side of the room, and that's known as a shared room. And that's usually discussed before you move in. Or you could have an exclusive room, which is your own. And some of them might look like apartments or in a little house, or they might have their own ensuite. Those are some of the things that you might want to discuss before entering an arrangement in a rooming house. Usually a rooming house does need to be licensed by the council, and you can check that by going to the Consumer Affairs Victoria website and looking at the registry list. Of course, there are a lot of informal ones as well. They should be licensed, but we are well aware that there's a few in the community that fall below that standard. If you're concerned about that, definitely get in touch with us. We can have a chat about your circumstances and what that means for you. Doesn't mean we're going to go guns in blazing, shutting the place down, but it would still be good for you to know what implications that has. And one of the last things that is probably one of the most easily identifiable things with the rooming house is that the operator can choose what room you're in and who is in the house. Normally with a share house, it would normally be like a friend recommending another friend. With a rooming house, the rooming house operator has that, that ultimate power to make that decision, even though you could refer a friend over if you wanted to. So this is just to highlight what a rooming house can be. So the one on the left, we can see there's a lot of rooms, there's multiple bathrooms, there's a large shared space in the middle here, and then each room has their own courtyard. So this looks like one of the nicer rooming houses that I've seen. And then we've got this one over here on the right. So this one gets a lot of people questioning because it looks like a normal share house, but technically, even though it's only a 2-bedroom home, it can still fit up to 4 people if you're having a shared room, kind of agreement in place. So watch out for that, because, it can look like any other house out there. Of course, the one on the left looks really fun and, having a lot of people around and whatnot, but it could also be said for the house on the right as well. Well, for me, it's the right. So I'm hoping for you, it's the right. So it's the one with the 2-bedroom house and the little garage and the shed. So moving on, this is what a rooming house agreement looks like now. So this is just the first page of 8. I have linked it in the other slide if you want to go have a look, but it can also be found on the Consumer Affairs Victoria website. I just wanted to show this because it does look a little bit different to the rental agreement that we're going to go through with the share house agreements. So with rooming house agreements, these are one of the amendments that came into effect from the 29th of March. If you're entering a fixed term agreement, being again a locked in period, you must use the rooming house agreement form here if it's in writing. So with fixed term agreements, it must be in writing and it must be in the prescribed form, being this form here. Usually with rooming house agreements, it's not more than 5 years. So if it's an agreement less than 5 years, you can use this form. Anything over 5, technically, it's not covered under a rooming house agreement. It should state the terms and conditions, and if it's not, discuss that thoroughly beforehand. So what is included in your room and what facilities and utilities can you use around the house? Check whether your bills are covered, whether your Wi-Fi is covered. All that stuff should be in that agreement. The other kind of arrangement you can enter into is a periodic. So you can enter into like either a short period through the fixed term, or if you want to leave it open-ended, periodic agreements are more common in rooming houses. They can be in writing. They don't need to be in writing. Again, we highly recommend utilizing the form. It is there for a purpose to, just alleviate all the inconsistencies and ambiguities that can arise. So highly recommend that. Technically, you can create your own form, but we wouldn't recommend it. So with like what I was saying before the 29th of March, existing residency agreements are still potentially in effect until they finish, and then it would move over to one of these newer standards. But you might also hear through friends and whatnot that they're in a residential tenancy agreement, even though they're in a rooming house. So it might throw you off, but it just means that they're on one of the older ones before the 29th of March. Okay, so we're moving back to Georgia to cover share houses and co-tenancies now.
Great, thanks. That's really great information about the changes to the rooming house provisions. But we're going to go into share houses and co-tenancy. Now, this is probably the most common type of share house arrangement. I was in a share house for all of my university years, up to 5 people in one. It was pretty hectic. And effectively, it means that if there is more than 2 people that are named on the lease, that's a co-tenancy. And there's some important things to know about a co-tenancy. So the first one, and I'm not really reading them in order, is that renters are jointly and severally liable under the agreement. And that means effectively if the landlord, I said landlord, the rental provider suffers any sort of loss or damage, or there's rent arrears, it means that they can pursue any or all of the tenants for the whole amount of the claim. If you are in this type of situation, certainly do seek advice and reach out to us so you know your rights. Importantly, a co-tenancy doesn't end until all co-tenants leave the premises or return the keys. So if you move out of a shared house before the lease ends and your name is still on the lease, you might be held liable for any loss or damage. So it's really important to remove your name off the agreement when you leave. Also, something I'll flag here now is the Act does not cover the rights and responsibilities of co-tenants in relation to each other. So if you guys have a dispute, that's something that you will have to work out, because the Residential Tenancies Act just doesn't cover it. It certainly is there to protect you, but who pays what in respect to rent and utilities, that is an agreement between renters. We have a saying here, keep the mates and flatmates. Jump on our website to have a look how you can do that. I'll move on to the next slide, which is some examples. I'm going to read out Tracy and Tony's story because it is a classic example of a co-tenancy. So Tracy and Tony have been friends since primary school, and after finishing school, they decided to come to Australia, do their further studies, and they wanted to find a rental property. So they go to the real estate agent, fill in the application, they both sign the lease, and they're both on the bond. That is the perfect example of a co-tenancy. Now, the second one is Billy, and he brings his friend to the house. So he's on the lease by himself. Tom moves in and gets his name put on the lease. So that is, if you want someone to move in with you, get that reflected on the lease, and that will avoid you and Tom in this circumstance getting in any trouble. So that's a really good indication of where somebody is assigned onto the lease. Now, the third situation is Tracy, Benji, and Alex. So they've been living in this rental property. They're all students. Ben finishes the degree, moves into state, and Tracy and Alex are left there. They've got to finish their degrees. So they can't afford to live there. However, Ben has a friend that can move in. What they do is they arrange to assign Ben's name off and Sean's name on. And they can organise the documents by going for the real estate agent. This last example is a great example of the renters doing the right thing. You're assigning the lease. You're having one of the outgoing renters assign the names off so they're not liable, and then the new tenant coming in so that he is accurately reflected on the lease. We have a really useful information guide on our website in respect to assignments about what they are and how you can do it. It's really simple, but we'll take you to the next slide so we can give you some more information. So if you're a co-tenant, you really need to make sure your name is on, all the names of the tenants is on the lease. And this here is a copy of the new residential rental agreement. If you'd like to have a look at it, you can download it from the Consumer Affairs Victoria website. Their logo is on the top right-hand corner of it. It's important to make sure the landlord knows the changes of who is on the lease. So if someone's leaving or someone's coming on, put it in writing and let your landlord know.
Okay, so back to me and on subletting. So this one, it kind of plays off the co-tenancy / share house circumstance, but it's slightly different, and it means something slightly different for the person getting someone into the property. That's why we wanted to cover this. So essentially, the renter that's initially in the property, so person A, rents the property from the rental provider and then decides that they want to rent part or all of the property to another person, so person B. So did you know that before subletting, you need to get approval or permission from the rental provider? So it's not an overly difficult process. It's just, hey, rental provider, can I sublease? And they usually have to give you permission unless there's a good reason not to. So, it's definitely something that should be discussed with us, if the landlord or the rental provider is pushing back, because then we'll be able to help you assess your circumstances and, help you understand whether it is a good reason to dismiss your application or not. So there are also implications for the renter if they choose to sublet. So what that could look like, just as an example, is, again, we're going back to Tracy. Tracy's a good friend of mine, as you can tell. So Tracy's had their hours decreased at work, and so now they're a little bit strapped for cash. That's everyone's story during COVID, right? And so what did a lot of people do? They got some assistance in, whether it's a short-term or a long-term lease. In this case, Tracy found Tony. They joined the lease for a 3-month period, and then Tony paid the bond, a bond to Tracy and the first month's rent. And so you will see at the bottom, I did put a little thing in there saying that Tracy did get the rental provider's permission first. And then so Tony moved into the spare bedroom that Tracy had for that 3-month period. Simple as that. But what does that mean for Tracy? So then person A, being Tracy, is now a head renter, and then person B, being Tony, is now a sub renter. So what that actually means is a head renter is anyone that is initially on the rental agreement. So again, it could be a co-tenancy and then you decide to have someone move in with you shortly, hence why we went through the co-tenancy first. So anyone that's on the initial lease now becomes a head renter. And then what that actually means as a head renter is that you're taking on the responsibilities of a rental provider. And I don't know if a lot of people are aware of that, but they're actually responsible for meeting those mandatory requirements that are now enforced through the new amendments. So you're essentially becoming a rental provider to the sub-renter, but you've still got rights as a renter to your initial rental provider. So a little bit of a chain going on. But again, if you're not sure or you're concerned that you're signing into something like this, let us know. Let's have a chat. It's a very quick and easy identifiable thing. So that basically brings us to the end of our first episode. We do have 3 more episodes after this, the next one starting next week. We were too impatient to continue it on in the next month, so we're doing another one next week. Same time, again, it's going to be recorded. So then the next one, we're going to be talking about starting your tenancy, what that means, what you should cover to protect yourself. And then we're going to go into during your tenancy in the 3rd episode and some common problems. And then lastly, what happens when you want to leave or when you do leave.